certainly appreciate your attendance this morning. It's a beautiful morning. We are looking forward to our Bible class and our worship service this morning. We're studying this morning in the 51st chapter of Jeremiah, beginning with the 50th verse. Chapters 50 and 51 of Jeremiah, as we have studied here in the last couple weeks, relate to the destruction of Babylon. And intertwined in this discussion, there is a reference to the Jews, to Jerusalem. And that's where we are this morning in the 50th verse of the 51st chapter of Jeremiah. Going back to verse 49, says, "As Babylon hath caused the slain of Israel to fall," and by the way, history would indicate, and our study of Scripture would indicate, that Babylon was very enthusiastic, even though God had commissioned, in a sense, Babylon to overtake Jerusalem. They were very enthusiastic and very cruel as they went about their assignment, I guess you would say. And they desecrated the temple. They just were very anxious to destroy every segment of that civilization, of the Jewish civilization. But in the 49th verse, as Babylon hath caused the slain of Israel to fall, so Babylon shall fall, the slain of all the earth. Babylon is going to be treated in a very negative way by God's commissioned Persians, Medo-Persian Empire. Then in verse 50, Jeremiah directs his attention to the Jews. "Ye that have escaped the sword, go away." He's warning them, those that have escaped the sword. Now, we don't have any knowledge. We don't have any clear projections in Scripture as how many Jews were carried away into captivity. Babylon assaulted Jerusalem 3 times. At least Nebuchadnezzar assaulted Jerusalem 3 times. And each time he carried away captives. Now, if you were going to carry away captives and you're going to let them live, what kind of captives would you want? You probably want those who were physically fit, those that were in positions that had accomplished things, okay? The craftsmen, people that would be useful to you, you know, in your economy. Well, that's each time they assaulted, the record shows that there was X number, and we'll maybe get into that today, X number carried away in the first captivity, the second captivity, and the third captivity. Now, those numbers don't reflect all of the people that were carried away into captivity, but it does reflect some of the people that were carried away into captivity. Now, God, through Jeremiah, is saying, look, you Jews, you get your minds oriented to something other than captivity. He says, "Ye that have escaped the sword," those that are obviously still living, "go away, stand not still. Remember the Lord afar off, and let Jerusalem come into your mind." Start thinking about Jerusalem. Now, you know, if we if we were a body of people in Babylon and knew that and had been warned that an assault is coming, would probably want to get out of Dodge. But on the other hand, what was Jerusalem like at this point in terms of after Babylon fell? What was Jerusalem like? Rubble. You know, who would want to go back to rubble? Well, Jeremiah says you get your minds oriented to Jerusalem, to the temple, to the Jewish system, you know, the law of Moses, the culture of Jerusalem as it was, earlier. Get your minds on Jerusalem. We are confounded because we have heard reproach. Now he's, I think he's putting his emphasis back, or he's intensifying his message here. We are confounded because we have heard reproach. Now, shame has covered our face, for strangers are come into the sanctuaries of the Lord's house. Where were the articles of furniture and the bowls and the fixtures in the temple? Where were those things now? Were they in Jerusalem? No, they were in Babylon. So there wasn't much to go back to, but Jeremiah says, you get your minds focused on Jerusalem, and they were. Why would they have been ashamed? Wherefore, well, we're confounded because we have heard reproach. Shame hath covered our face. Why were they ashamed? The good Jews, why would they be ashamed? Why did they get punished? Because of their wrongdoings, you see. We are confounded because we have heard reproach. Shame hath covered our face. Strangers have come into the sanctuaries of the Lord's house. Now, going back to the Jewish religious ceremonies, how many people were authorized to go into the Holy of Holies in the temple? How often? Now, but here these foreigners come in and disgrace the temple, tore it apart, stole things out of it, and so, they're reminded of this, of course. Wherefore, behold, in verse 52, wherefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will do judgment upon her graven images. Each community of people, each body politic, each city, each nation had its own god. The Babylonians had a god. The main god of the Babylonians was Bel, B-E-L. And they assumed that their god would protect them. Right? The people of Jerusalem assumed God, Jehovah God, would protect them. Well, God's punishment of these people really came back to the graven images of these nations that were being judged, being punished. That I will do judgment upon her graven images. And through all of her land, the wounded shall groan. People shall groan as a response to, within the midst of this destruction. In verse 53, though Babylon should mount up to heaven, though she should fortify the height of her strength, yet from me shall spoilers come unto her, saith the Lord. What is he saying there? regardless of how militarily strong they are, culturally strong, regardless of how fortified they are, that's going to be to no avail, because God had commissioned the spoilers. Now, who are the spoilers? Well, the main spoilers would be the Medo-Persian group. So this destruction was just inevitable. Verse 54, a sound of cry cometh from Babylon, and great destruction from the land of the Chaldeans. Now, whether this was a battle cry from the Medo-Persian army approaching, or whether it was a cry of destruction as a result of the destruction within the Babylonian community, it's various opinions about that. But the sound of cry cometh from Babylon, from destruction, from the land of the Chaldeans. Now that language seems to indicate that the cry would come up from the people that were destroyed, or being destroyed, and that would have been the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. Verse 55, because the Lord hath spoiled Babylon, and destroyed out of her the great voice, where her waves do roar like great waters, a noise of their voice is uttered. Now, these Babylonians, in their culture, at the zenith of their power, they were loud and boisterous. They were arrogant. They were arrogant because they felt they were they couldn't be destroyed. That they were not. That there's just no way that any power could overcome them. Well, what they didn't realize was that the Lord, Jehovah God, was behind this these military maneuvers, because the Lord has spoiled Babylon and destroyed out of her the great voice, dampened that voice of arrogance. When her waves do roar like great waters, they were so boastful, and they were so arrogant that it was as if they were, ocean waves, as awesome as ocean waves. Then verse 56, because the spoiler is come upon her, even upon Babylon, and her mighty men are taken, every one of their bows is broken, for the Lord of recompense shall surely requite or pay back. They are going to receive what they sowed. They sowed destruction across the world, the known world. They're going to receive destruction. Further, he illuminates here by saying, and I will make drunk her princes, and her wise men, and her captains, and her rulers, and her mighty men. And they shall sleep a perpetual sleep, and not wake until the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts, saith the Lord, the King, the Lord of hosts. It was the picture of being in a drunken stupor, make them like that, but they wouldn't wake. They would be dead. They would be destroyed. Verse 58, and thus said the Lord of hosts, the broad walls of Babylon shall be utterly broken. Now, history records that these walls weren't broken down immediately. They were broken down sufficient for the takeover by a foreign power. But it was over time that these walls were broken down, that the city was, over time, the city was left, Babylon was left in a rock heap. The broad walls of Babylon shall be utterly spoken. You see, the broad walls, the walls were their security. Well, their security has been breached, or would be breached. And their gates, archaeologists, scholars indicate that they had 45 gates. You can imagine how awesome those gates would be. And the scripture says here in the prophecy is that they would be burned with fire, that destruction would come upon the gates of the city, and they shall be weary. Well, obviously, that would be the case. People, in battle zones, would be terribly weary. So Jeremiah here has displayed on his pages here the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of Babylon. Now, his message then, his book then has a change here in terms of events. Beginning with verse 59, and he goes back to a period when Zedekiah was king. Now, Zedekiah was the last king of Judah. He was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. His sons were killed in front of him. His eyes were put out. He was carried away into captivity. But sometime during his reign, this little snippet of narration of history is provided. Why this is provided? I have no idea, but it must be important, or it wouldn't have been provided, because there are a lot of other things that Jeremiah could have talked about. And here he says, and here's this little snippet of history. So Jeremiah wrote in the book all the evils that should come upon Babylon. Well, I suppose Jeremiah wrote a lot of things that God didn't see fit to pass on to future generations. But so Jeremiah, let's go back to verse 60. So Jeremiah wrote in a book all the evil that should come upon Babylon. He wrote a little narrative. Even all those words that are written against Babylon. How long this narration was, I don't know. But verse 61, he says, and Jeremiah said to Syria, when thou comest to Babylon, and shall see, and shall read all these words. Now, this person, Syria, must have been some officer of the king, and was going to be taking a trip to Babylon. So let's get this picture clearly in mind. And the word which Jeremiah the prophet commanded Syria, the son of Neriah, the son of Maaseiah, when he went with Zedekiah the king of Judah into Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. Now, why would Zedekiah be going to Babylon when Babylon was at war with Jerusalem? Well, Zedekiah had made an assault on Jerusalem, dethroned the king there, and appointed Zedekiah, who was in David's lineage, by the way, appointed Zedekiah king. Now, if somebody appoints you, to whom are you accountable? The king. So, for whatever reason, the king Zedekiah was making a trip to Babylon. This would have been quite a venture because of the travel arrangements. But so this government official and probably an entourage of others in Zedekiah's cabinet, they went to Babylon in the 4th year of Zedekiah's reign. Well, Zedekiah reigned 11 years, so it was about midway through his reign there. And Syria was a quiet prince. Now, the King James Center column here says that he was a supply clerk, kind of in charge of, took care of things in terms of what they needed for their journey. But he was an official. So Jeremiah wrote in the book, all the evil that should come upon Babylon, even all these words that are written against Babylon. And Jeremiah said unto Syria, when thou comest to Babylon, and shall see, and shall read all these words. Now, to whom is he going to read this? Is he going to read it to Nebuchadnezzar? Well, or verse 62 says, then shalt thou say, O Lord, thou hast spoken against this place to cut it off, that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but that it shall be desolate forever. It is assumed here that this word would be given to the people of the Jewish captives. Now, I suppose there was communication between some folks in the Jerusalem area at that time, because Jerusalem was still standing, and communication between some of those people and some of the captives in Babylon. They no doubt had communication systems. And then in verse 63, and it shall be, when thou hast made an end of the reading of this book, that thou shalt bind a stone to it, and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. Now, why such an act as that? What's the object lesson there? He's going to take his words and tie a rock on it and throw it in the Euphrates. Well, what does that say to the world? Well, and thou shalt say, no doubt he had people. Maybe when he did this, he threw it in the river, and he said to the people that were there, thus shall Babylon sink, and shall not rise from the evil that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. So that's just a little piece of history that God wanted people to know in the future, that came about during Zedekiah's administration. And then there's a footnote here. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. This is a verification that this was Jeremiah's recording of this particular narrative. Now then, see, chapters 50 and 51 just relate to the destruction of Babylon. And now, for whatever reason, the book of Jeremiah contains a bit of history with regard to a time when Zedekiah was in his reign in Jerusalem. And so this last chapter of Jeremiah then relates to something that happened prior to some of these prophecies of Jeremiah. So in chapter 52, we change subjects here. It says Zedekiah was 120 years. Zedekiah was 120 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. Well, he did that. It was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and Jeremiah has mentioned that several times in his book. According to all that Jehoiakim had done. Now Jehoiakim was carried away into Babylonian captivity, as you recall. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, till he had cast them out from the presence that Zedekiah rebelled from. He had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So here we have a narrative with regard to what was happening, what happened when Zedekiah was taken away, removed by Nebuchadnezzar. So we'll just read through this rather quickly, because this is just kind of a repeat of what we already have learned from the prophecy of Jeremiah. And so in verse 4, and by the way, this is recorded in 2 Kings, and so it's been recorded, in multiple places in Scripture. And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, and he and all his army, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and built forts against it around about. So the city was besieged into the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So now, if we looked at Lamentations, we would get a picture of how bad that destruction was. Jeremiah's Lamentations, he says, and I'll skip over there for a moment, chapter 1 of Lamentations, how does the city sit solitary, that was full of people? How has she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations, and princess among the provinces, how has she become tributary? She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all of her lovers she hath none to comfort her, and all of her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction, and because of great servitude, and of affliction and great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen. She findeth no rest. All of her persecutors overtook her because of the straits, and so on. Just there, Jeremiah was, lamenting over how Jerusalem ended up. Well, what was the Why did this happen? Well, let's look at verse 3 there. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass Jerusalem, Judah, till he had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, and he and all his army against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and built forts against it around about. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of Zedekiah. Now, do you suppose there during that period of time when they were surrounded by the armies of Babylon, do you suppose they could get supplies in and out of the city? Not so. Do you suppose they had a lot of provisions, corn and grain and food stuff? Do you suppose they had sufficient sustenance to life? Well, no. So it was, they essentially starved them out while they were tearing the walls down. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And in the 4th month, in the 9th day of the month, the famine was sore in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. So there was famine, starvation. Then the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled and went forth out of the city. The people that were to protect Jerusalem were getting out. Then the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled and went forth out of the city by night and by the way of the gate between the two walls, which was by the king's garden. Now the Chaldeans were by the city around about, and they went by the way of the plain. So those that were to protect the city fled. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued after the king. Now, the king was among them. The army of the Chaldeans pursued after the king and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho, and his army was scattered from him. And they took the king, carried him up to the king of Babylon, to Riblah. Now, Riblah was way north of Judah. But so it was probably a long travel time to get to Nebuchadnezzar, where he was holding forth. So they carried him to the king of Babylon, to Riblah, in the land of Hamath, where he gave judgment upon him. So Nebuchadnezzar, who had appointed Zedekiah as king of Judah, now he's pronouncing judgment on him. And the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. He slew also all the princes of Judah in Riblah. So Zedekiah and his entourage, his cabinet, the people that were close to him, the princes there, they were killed as well. And he put out the eyes of Zedekiah. And the king of Babylon bound him in chains and carried him to Babylon and put him in prison till the day of his death. Now, I'm sure prisons in Babylon weren't holiday inns. So he had a sorry end to his life. And no eyes. Yeah. Now in the 5th month, in verse 12, now in the 5th month of the 10th day of the month, which was the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, which served the king of Babylon, into Jerusalem. He came now, Nebuchadnezzar's captain, his commander, came into Jerusalem. And he came in there to finish off Jerusalem, so to speak. And he burned the house of the Lord. Now remember, there was a lot of cedar wood in that temple. Solomon, by the way, that temple was put there by Solomon about 375 years before this time. Here's a temple that stood almost 4 centuries, and now was being burned, destroyed. And he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. So he specifically, he's the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem and all the houses of the great men burned he with fire. So he started with the king's house, which was no doubt elaborate, and he burned those, the mansions, so to speak, but he burned all the houses. And all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guard break down all the walls of Jerusalem. So they made sure they got rid of the walls, so that if anybody took residence here, they would be without any security. And then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, that is Nebuchadnezzar, captain of the guard, carried away captives certain of the poor of the people and the residue of the people that remained in the city. So here's, he doesn't say how many of these poor people he carried away into captivity, but they, and those that fell away, some of them just gave up, that fell to the king of Babylon, the rest of the multitude. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left certain of the poor of the land for vine dressers and husbandmen. So they left some people there in that rubble and in the area round about Jerusalem. And the pillars of brass that were in the house of the Lord, and the bases and the brazen sea that was in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans brake and carried all the brass of them to Babylon. In the first Kings, when Solomon built the temple, there's a description of all the ornamentation and all of the fixtures in the temple, and the columns, and it was just an elaborate. You remember, David had accumulated materials to build the temple, and this temple and its grounds were tremendously elaborate. And these Chaldeans, these Babylonians, they took what they could take back to Babylon, all the fixtures of the temple. They broke up everything else, and so you kind of wonder what happened to the Ark of the Covenant during all this. Preacher, what happened to the Ark of the Covenant? It's not mentioned, but it's certainly, as Tim said, you never heard of it again. So this was a sacred place. Turn off your cell phones, would you? I forgot to follow my own rule. I remember being at a meeting one time, and the person said, "Now you people turn off your cell phones. You don't have any cell phones." And just that moment, his cell phone. So anyway, and the pillars of brass that were in the house of the Lord, and the bases and the brazen sea, and all that was in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans break, and you can imagine their pleasure and enthusiasm for breaking. And they carried away the brass of them to Babylon. The cauldrons, that is, the pots, the basins, and the shovels, and the snuffers, and the bowls, and the spoons, and all the vessels of the brass wherewith they ministered, took they away. And the basins, and the fire pans, and the bowls, and the cauldrons, and the candlesticks, and the spoons, and the cups, and the that were of gold, and that which was of silver, and silver took the captain of the guard away. So he took all of those things away, and they were valuable, gold and silver. And the two pillars, one sea, and 12 brazen bowls that were under the bases, which King Solomon had made in the house of the Lord. The brass of all these vessels was without weight. It was a tremendous undertaking here to break up all of this stuff. Verse 21, and concerning the pillars, and the height of one pillar was 18 cubits. How much? That would be, 27 feet. And the fillet of 12 cubits did compass it, and the thickness thereof was 4 fingers, and it was hollow. And the chapiter of brass was upon it, and the height of the chapiter was 5 cubits, with network and pomegranates upon the chapiters round about all of the brass. And the second pillar was also of the pomegranates were like these. These were ornate kind of pillars. They were put together with craftsmen had to chisel these flower arrangements and so forth into the pillars at the time of Solomon. And there were 96 pomegranates on a side, and all the pomegranates upon the network were 100 around about. Well, now think about how much destruction took place there. Well, then he turns his attention to another scene here. Verse 24 beginning. And the captain of the guard took Syria, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the second priest, and the 3 keepers of the door, the people that were in charge of the temple grounds and so forth. And he took also of the city a eunuch, which had the charge of the men of war, and 7 men of them that were near the king's person, which were found in the city, and the principal scribe of the host, who mustered the people of the land, and 70 men of the people of the land that were found in the midst of the city. And so Nebuchadnezzar, the captain of the guard, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon in Riblah. It's north of Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon smote them and put them to death in Riblah, the land of Hamath. Thus Judah was carried away captive out of his own land. Now then, beginning with verse 28, he delineates some of the people, the class of people that were carried away and the number of them. This is the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive. In the 11th year, 3,000 Jews and 3,023 Jews. Now that obviously didn't represent all the captives, but this was a group of captives that got special mention. In verse 29, in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, he carried away captive from Jerusalem 832 persons. Now, isn't it interesting how Scripture in some places is very specific, in terms of numbers. Why? I don't know. And then, in the 18th year, Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive from Jerusalem 832. So he mentions three periods of time, 3 attacks, you see. And then verse 30, and in 3 and 20th year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive of the Jews 745. So 745. And all the persons were 4,600. Well, then, there's another little snippet of history here. In the last few verses of chapter 52 of Jeremiah. And it came to pass in the 7 and 30th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin. Now Jehoiachin lived at the same time, reigned just before Zedekiah was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to take over the throne of Jerusalem or Judah. And he was carried away into captivity, and it came to pass in the 7th and 30th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and the 12th month and the 5th and 20th day of the month, that Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him forth out of prison. And he spake kindly unto him, and set his throne above the thrones of the kings that were in Babylon, and changed his prison garments, and he did continually eat bread before him all the days of his life. And for his diet there was a continual diet given him of the king of Babylon, every day a portion unto the day of his death, and all the days of his life. Now, isn't that interesting? Here's a little narrative about Jehoiachin as Jeremiah's book ends. So, next week we're going to be dealing with Lamentations, since this destruction of Jerusalem is on our mind.